The United States government offered $40,000 to catch one woman. She was a formerly enslaved person, 5 feet tall. She had a hole in her skull from a 2-pound lead weight. She could not read. She could not write. She had no army, no money, no name that the law recognized. And she went back 19 times into the land that wanted to own her. 19 times. They never caught her, not once. Her name at birth was Araminta Ross, not Harriet. That name came later. She was born sometime between 1820 and 1825. No one recorded the exact date. Enslaved people were not given the dignity of dates. They were given tasks. They were given numbers. They were given scars, but not dates. She was born on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Eastern Shore, flat land, marshes thick with timber. The kind of land that watched you. The kind of land that swallowed sound, where a person could disappear and no one would hear them go. Her father was Benjamin Ross. Her mother was Rit Green, both enslaved, both owned by different men. Her mother belonged to a man named Edward Brodess. Her father belonged to a man named Anthony Thompson. 2 families, 2 plantations, 1 marriage that the law did not recognize. The law did not recognize their love. The law did not recognize their children. The law saw only property. Araminta was one of 9 children. She watched 3 of her sisters sold south before she could count their names. One morning they were there. The next morning they were gone. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. She said her mother screamed when they took them. She said she never forgot that sound. She was 5 years old the first time she was hired out. Hired out. That is what they called it. A woman named Miss Susan took her to check muskrat traps in the cold, in December, wading through ice water before dawn. She was 5 years old. She was beaten when she failed. She was beaten when she cried. She was beaten when she was too slow and when she was too tired. When she failed at a task, any task, she was beaten. She carried those scars her entire life. She described them in interviews decades later, as if they had never stopped burning. The plantation was not just a place of labor. It was a place designed to unmake a person, to take a name, to take a family, to take time itself, to take everything that makes a human being feel human, and leave only the labor, only the body, only the use. Araminta Ross was not unmade. She was about 13 years old, maybe 12. The records are unclear because no one was keeping records for her. She had been sent to a dry goods store. An overseer was there. A man named, the name has been lost, but the act has not. He wanted to chain an enslaved man who had left the fields without permission. The man had done nothing violent. He had simply walked away for a moment. That was enough. That was all it ever took. Araminta stepped into the doorway. She blocked the path. She did not speak. She did not threaten. She simply stood. She did not move. The overseer grabbed a 2-pound iron weight from the counter. He threw it. It was not aimed at her. It was meant for the man behind her. It hit her anyway. It struck her in the skull. She fell. She did not wake up for days. They sent her back to her enslaver's house. No doctor. No treatment. She was put to work the next day, bleeding. She said she could feel her brain pressing against the wound. For the rest of her life, she suffered what she called sleeping spells. They came without warning. She could be in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a meal, in the middle of leading people through swampland in the dark, and she would fall, unconscious, gone, for minutes at a time, sometimes longer. And when she woke, she remembered nothing. The world had moved on without her, and she had to find it again. Doctors today recognize this as a form of temporal lobe epilepsy caused by traumatic brain injury. She carried that overseer's violence in her skull for 80 years. Every sleeping spell, his. Every missing hour, his. Every moment of darkness, his. She never got a single one of them back. And during these sleeping spells, she saw things. She said God spoke to her. She described vivid visions. She described knowing things before they happened, knowing which roads were safe, knowing which men could be trusted, knowing when to move and when to be still. Whether one believes that or not, she believed it, completely, without doubt, without hesitation, and it made her fearless, in a way that frightened the people around her, because she did not fear death the way most people fear death. She had already been to the edge of it. She had already looked into that dark, and she had come back. That iron weight that was meant to destroy her became the thing that made her unbreakable. Edward Brodess was dying. That was the word on the plantation in 1849. He was sick. He had debts. When an enslaver died in debt, his enslaved people were sold, split apart, scattered south, to cotton fields in Mississippi, to sugar fields in Louisiana, to places from which no one returned, or if they returned broken, in ways that had no name. Araminta Ross had already lived through the sale of her sisters. She had watched her family be severed. She had prayed for Brodess to die before he could sell more of them. She said in later years, with her voice steady, that she had prayed for him to change. She had prayed sincerely. She had prayed on her knees. She said she prayed until her voice went raw. And when he would not change, she said she changed the prayer. She prayed for God to take him. And she said afterward she felt terrible about it until she didn't. Until she understood that some prayers are acts of survival. Edward Brodess died on March 7th, 1849, and his widow began making arrangements to sell. Araminta heard the rumors. She heard her name spoken in the arrangements. She and her brothers Benjamin and Henry, to be sold, south. She made a decision. Not a plan exactly. Not yet. A decision. She later described it in an interview with a journalist named Benjamin Drew in 1855. She said, and these are nearly her words, there was one of two things she had a right to, liberty or death. If she could not have one, she would have the other. She was not speaking in metaphor. Her husband was a free black man named John Tubman. She had married him in 1844. She loved him. That detail matters. She loved him and she still left. Because she loved herself more. Because she loved the idea of being free more than she feared being alone. John Tubman had no interest in leaving Maryland. He was already free. He had nothing to lose, or so he believed. He told her if she ran, he would report her. He said it plainly. Without anger, some accounts say, just as a fact. She took his name anyway, and she left him behind. She would later take her mother's first name as well, Harriet. The woman who ran was no longer Araminta Ross. She was Harriet Tubman, and she walked into the dark. She left in September of 1849, in the dark, alone. She had told no one except two people she trusted with her life. Her brothers came with her at first, Benjamin and Henry. They walked together for a night, and then the fear came for them. They turned back. Fear, not weakness. Fear's not weakness. Fear is what the body does when it understands what is at stake. Her brothers understood, and they turned back. She continued. She did not stop. She did not look back. She traveled roughly 90 miles, on foot, through marshland and forest, at night, sleeping in haystacks and beneath riverbanks during the day, hiding under leaves, hiding under water when she had to, breathing through a hollow reed, one account says. She followed the North Star. She had been told to look for a certain moss that grows on the north side of trees. She listened to the sound of water. She moved without a map because there was no map made for her. The roads that existed were for people who were allowed to use them. She was not allowed to use anything. So she used everything. She used the Underground Railroad. Not a railroad, not underground. A network of people, black and white. Quakers, free black families, people who opened their doors at night and asked no questions that could be used in court. People who fed her and hid her and sent her on with a name and a direction. One of those people was a white woman on the eastern shore. Harriet had been given her name by another enslaved woman. She found the house. She was given a piece of paper with 2 names on it. 2 conductors, 2 stops north. She burned the paper after memorizing it. Because paper could be found. Paper could be used against the people whose names it carried. She protected them even then. Even running for her life, she protected them. She crossed into Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Freedom. She later described that moment. She said when she crossed that line, everything was strange. The land was the same. The sky was the same. The trees looked the same. The air smelled the same. But she was free. She said there was no one to welcome her. No one who knew her. No one who had ever known her name. No celebration. No ceremony. She said she was a stranger in a strange land. And her family was still in Maryland. She had been free for less than an hour. And she was already planning to go back. Not because freedom wasn't worth it, but because freedom shared is the only freedom worth having. 1 year after she crossed into Pennsylvania, the United States government passed a law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It required every American citizen in every state, including free states, to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. Not to tolerate it, not to allow it, to assist actively. Under penalty of federal law, a person who refused to help capture a fugitive could be fined $1,000, could be imprisoned. Philadelphia was no longer safe. Boston was no longer safe. New York was no longer safe. Nowhere in the United States was safe. Slave catchers, men paid by enslavers to track and return, fugitives, moved freely through northern cities. They walked the streets of Philadelphia in broad daylight. They watched the docks. They watched the churches. They watched the schools where free black children learned to read. They had federal authority behind them now. Federal marshals were required to enforce their claims. A black person in Philadelphia could be grabbed off the street, brought before a federal commissioner. No jury, no trial in the traditional sense, just a piece of paper, a sworn statement from a white man in a southern state, and gone. Sent south in chains before their family knew they were missing. Some of those people had been free their entire lives. Born free, raised free, and taken anyway. The law made freedom a fiction. Frederick Douglass, who had himself escaped slavery from the same eastern shore of Maryland, wrote that the act was a declaration of war. He was not speaking in metaphor either. He was speaking from experience. He was speaking from memory. He knew exactly what the machinery of that law could do to a person. Harriet Tubman responded to the Fugitive Slave Act with the only language available to her. She went back to Maryland. In December of 1850, 1 month after the law was signed, she returned to the Eastern Shore. 1 month, while free black communities in the North were still trying to understand what the law meant. She had already made her answer. She brought out her niece, Keziah Bowley. Keziah's husband, John Bowley, and their 2 children. Keziah had been scheduled to be sold at public auction in Cambridge, Maryland. On a Tuesday morning, John Bowley outbid every other buyer and then stalled for time. While the auctioneer waited for his money, Keziah and the children were already on a boat, heading up the Chesapeake to Baltimore, where Harriet was waiting. The auction house never collected. The auctioneer never saw them again, and Harriet Tubman had completed her first rescue mission, the first of many. She made 19 documented trips into slave territory. 19. Over the course of 11 years, 1849 to 1860, she brought out approximately 70 people directly, and she gave detailed instructions, routes, contacts, signals, to dozens more. Historians estimate she effected the escape of more than 300 people. 300 lives. 300 families who stayed whole. 300 futures that were not swallowed by the plantation. She never lost a passenger. Not one. Not in 11 years. Not in winter. Not in flood. Not with search parties on every road and dogs on every trail. Not one. She always left on a Saturday night, because the posting of runaway slave notices was done through newspaper offices, and newspaper offices were closed on Sunday. The alert could not be published until Monday morning. She had 48 hours before her name was in print. 48 hours before the countryside was watching. She used every second of those hours. She traveled in the winter. Cold, brutal cold, the kind of cold that keeps people indoors, that keeps dogs close to fires, that makes a road feel empty even in daylight, because slave catchers preferred warmth, because fewer people were outside to see, because the land was harder and quieter and honest. She went south to go north. Counterintuitive, deliberate. Pursuit always expected a fugitive to move immediately north. She moved toward the danger first, deep into Maryland, further south than her pursuers expected, then turned, and came north in a direction no one was watching. She carried a revolver. She was asked about this later. Why the gun? She said it was for two purposes. One, for any slave catcher who crossed her path. Two, for any passenger who lost their nerve and wanted to turn back. She did not say this lightly. She meant it. She said one person turning back could get them all killed or caught, which for many was the same thing, because being caught meant being sold south, and being sold south meant never seeing home again. She reportedly told wavering passengers, "Dead folks tell no tales." No one turned back. Not one person in 11 years turned back. Because when Harriet Tubman looked at you and told you to keep moving, you kept moving. The notices began appearing in 1849. The first one was placed by Eliza Brodess, widow of Edward Brodess. She offered $300 for the return of 3 runaways. One was listed as Minty. That was Harriet's old name, short for Araminta. $300. In 1849, that was a working man's full year of wages. As the years passed and the escapes multiplied, the reward grew. $1,000, then $5,000, then $12,000. The men whose property kept disappearing could not explain it, could not understand it. People who were supposed to be incapable of organization, incapable of strategy, incapable of anything beyond the labor they were forced to perform, were vanishing, family by family, night by night, and no one could tell them who was responsible. The figure that circulated most widely by the late 1850s was 40,000. That was the equivalent of more than $1 million today. For one woman, 5 feet tall, with a hole in her skull, who could not read, who could not write, who had no lawyers, no weapons beyond a revolver and a will. They did not know her face well enough to draw it accurately. Early notices described her as having a scar on her head and walking with a slight limp. They called her not bright. They called her prone to sleeping fits. They said she was unremarkable. They could not conceive what they were dealing with. Thomas Garrett was a Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware. He worked with Harriet for years. He provided shoes to people who had walked until their feet bled. He hid people in his warehouse. He fed people who had not eaten in days. He wrote a letter about her in 1868. He said he never met a person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God. He said she was the most extraordinary person he had ever known. Garrett had been convicted in 1848, a year before she began her missions, of harboring fugitive slaves. He was stripped of everything he owned, his entire estate, his home, his business, his savings, sold to satisfy the judgment. He stood in court afterward and told the judge that he had never in his life done anything he considered wrong, and that if anyone knew of a fugitive who needed assistance, they should send them to Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, Delaware. The judge stared at him. The courtroom went quiet, and Thomas Garrett went home to nothing and started over. These were the people in her network, people who had already paid every price and were not finished paying. She moved through that network like a shadow. She moved through it for 11 years, and she was never caught. She did not go back for strangers first. She went back for blood. In December of 1854, she sent a coded message to Maryland. She could not write. She dictated a letter to a free black man who could. It was addressed to a man named Jacob Jackson, a free black man in Dorchester County. The letter was deliberately vague, suspicious enough to be examined, because all letters to free black men in Maryland were examined, clear enough to those who knew its meaning. It referred to old folks who wished to see their children before the new year. Jacob Jackson understood. He told no one. He passed the message. He did not write it down. He spoke it quietly and let it move the way secrets move, person to trusted person, in the dark. On December 24th, 1854, Christmas Eve, Harriet Tubman was waiting in a field outside Bucktown, Maryland. Her 3 brothers came to her, Benjamin, Henry, and Henry's wife, Catherine. The same Benjamin and Henry who had turned back in 1849. They had lived 5 more years in chains since that night. 5 years of thinking about what might have been. They did not turn back this time. She brought them all the way to Philadelphia, then to Canada, because after the Fugitive Slave Act, Philadelphia was not far enough. The law had a long arm. Canada did not. She would return for her parents. In 1856, she brought her sister Rachel and Rachel's children north. Her elderly parents she retrieved in 1857. Her father, Benjamin Ross, was 70 years old. He had worked that land for 70 years. Every crop, every harvest, every tree cleared and every ditch dug. He had built that land with his hands, and he left it in the night. He could not walk the entire journey. She built a cart. She had him cover his eyes for portions of the route, so that if he was ever questioned, he could honestly say he had not seen the road. She protected him even from the knowledge that could hang him. She settled her parents in Auburn, New York, in a house she purchased from Senator William H. Seward, the same man who would later become Lincoln's Secretary of State, who understood exactly who he was selling to and why. She paid for that house herself. Every cent, with money earned doing laundry, doing domestic work, doing everything she had always done, but now for wages. Wages that were hers, with money she had never been paid. With labor that had been stolen from her for 30 years, she got it back. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Harriet Tubman was 40 years old, give or take. Her age was still not known precisely. She had spent 11 years as the most wanted conductor on the Underground Railroad. She had crossed into slave territory 19 times. She had never been caught. Now the war gave her something she had never had before. An army! She was recruited by the Union Army as a spy, as a scout, as a nurse. She operated in South Carolina, the Department of the South under General David Hunter. She arrived at Beaufort, South Carolina in May of 1862. She found thousands of formerly enslaved people who had fled to Union lines, people who were hungry, people who were sick, people who had walked through swamps for days and had nothing when they arrived. She organized the camp. She cooked. She nursed the wounded. She organized contraband women into laundry and cooking, brigades that fed the Union soldiers. She ran on almost no sleep. She ran on almost no food. And then she went into the field. She organized a network of black scouts,
many of them formerly enslaved,
who knew the waterways, the tides, the plantations, who knew where the Confederate pickets stood, who knew where the food stores were hidden, who knew which roads were mined and which were clear. She ran intelligence. She gathered reports. She fed information to Union commanders. And then, in the early morning hours of June 2nd, 1863, she led a military raid. She guided 3 Union gunboats up the Combahee River. In the dark, at night, she knew exactly where the Confederate torpedoes had been planted in the river. Her network had told her. The boats moved around them, silently, without a single explosion, without a single casualty. At dawn, the boats reached the plantations along the river's edge. And what happened next was reported in the Boston Commonwealth newspaper on July 10th, 1863. The newspaper reported that hundreds of enslaved people came running, carrying their children, carrying their bedding, carrying pigs and chickens and whatever they could lift, running to the riverbank, running toward the boats. The soldiers could not take everything. The docks became chaos. The newspaper reported they had to hold people back from capsizing the boats. 756 people. 756 people liberated in a single night. This was the first armed assault in American history led by a woman, and she was not done. She served the Union Army for 3 years, as nurse, as spy, as scout, as raid commander. She moved between South Carolina and Washington. She worked without rest. She worked without recognition. She was never paid a regular military salary. She was given $12 once. For 6 weeks of work, $12. She spent that money on supplies for the men in her unit. She supported herself by selling pies and root beer she made herself. By the side of the road, between missions, a woman who had just guided 3 gunboats through a Confederate minefield, selling baked goods to eat. After the war, after emancipation, after the Confederacy had been destroyed, Harriet Tubman returned to Auburn, New York. She was in her mid-40s.
She had no savings.
She had no pension. She had no formal recognition of any kind from the government she had served. Harriet Tubman applied to Congress for a pension. She had witnesses. She had letters from generals. She had documentation of her service that would have secured any white male soldier a lifelong pension without question. Secretary of State William Seward wrote on her behalf. Governor of New York wrote on her behalf. Generals testified on her behalf. Congress denied her petition. She applied again. Denied. She applied again. Denied. She applied again and again for 34 years. 34 years of applications to the government she had bled for. The same government that had once spent $40,000 trying to return her to bondage. In 1899, she was nearly 80 years old by then. Congress finally approved a pension, $20 a month. Not for her own service. As the widow of her second husband, Nelson Davis, a man who had died in 1888. Not for what she had done. For who she had married. She accepted the $20. She did not complain in public. She did not rage in public. She built a home for elderly black people with it. In Auburn, New York. She had never owned anything she did not build herself. That was not about to change now. She lived to be 91 years old. Perhaps older. No one recorded the exact date of her birth, so no one could be certain of her age in death. This final cruelty followed her even past the threshold. The system that had refused to record her birth also robbed her of the certainty of her own age at death. She outlived slavery. She outlived the war. She outlived Reconstruction. She outlived the men who had owned her. She outlived the men who had hunted her. She outlived the judges who had ruled against her. She outlived most of those who had tried to own her. In her later years, she worked with Susan B. Anthony. She spoke at suffrage conventions. She attended meetings. She traveled. She gave interviews. She sat for photographs. She looked directly into the camera every single time. She was asked once if she believed women should have the vote. She said she had suffered enough to believe it. She was still telling her story at 80 years old, still walking onto stages in church halls and meeting rooms, still remembered, still burning. Old men and women who had known her in slavery came to find her in those years. They sat in her house and remembered together. They were the last living people who had been through it. The last people who could say, I was there. She was admitted to the Auburn Home for the Elderly in her final months. The same home she had founded. The same wall she had built. The same floors she had scrubbed to raise the money to build them. She was surrounded by friends and family when she died. March 10th, 1913. Her last recorded words were, I go to prepare a place for you. Her name appeared on a runaway slave notice as Minty, a girl of no particular note, worth $300. The notice described her as of no value to her owner. Let that sit. Let that sit for a long moment. Of no value to her owner. The woman, they said, had no value. Freed approximately 300 people. Led a military raid that liberated 756 more. Served as a spy. Served as a nurse. Served as a commander. Built a home for the aged. Advocated for women's suffrage. And became the most famous conductor in the history of the Underground Railroad. She was awarded the Medal of the National Association of Colored Women. She was named General Tubman by the abolitionist community. She was sought out by Frederick Douglass, by William Lloyd Garrison, by men and women who had dedicated their lives to the same fight. They came to her. She did not go to them. The enslavers tried to erase her. The government tried to catch her. The law tried to undo her. Congress tried to ignore her. History, for a long time, tried to minimize her. Put her in a small box. A brave woman, a helpful woman, a symbol, not a strategist, not a commander, not a soldier, not what she actually was. She did not diminish. She did not diminish. Every name on that scroll is a person, with a life, with children, with descendants walking the earth today, because she went back 19 times, into the land that wanted to own her, into the dark that wanted to swallow her, with a hole in her skull, and a gun in her hand, and God's voice in her ear. And she brought them out. Every single one. They spent 11 years trying to catch her. They spent $40,000 trying to stop her. They wrote laws to undo what she had done. They denied her pension for 34 years. They put her name on a notice and called her property. They called her no value. They could not have been more wrong. And 111 years after her death, the world still speaks her name. Harriet.